Somewhere in the Unknown World, a collective refugee memoir by Kao Kalia Yang. For the refugees from everywhere, men, women, and children, whose fates have been held by the interests of nations, whose rights have been contested and denied, whose thirst and hunger go unheeded and unseen. The collection opens with a poem by the great American poet Lucille Clifton. Quilting. Somewhere in the unknown world, a yellow-eyed woman sits with her daughter, quilting. Some otherwhere, alchemists mumble over pots. Their chemistry stirs into science. Their science freezes into stone. In the unknown world, the woman, threading together her need and her needle, nods toward the smiling girl. Remember, this will keep us warm. How does this poem end? Do the daughters quilt? Do the alchemists practice their tables? Do the worlds continue spinning away from each other forever? And then I'll just read a little bit from the very first story, From Irina to Irene. Any passerby can tell you that Irina has dark hair and dark eyes. But if you look carefully at her, you'll see that Irina's thick hair is a deep auburn, and that her eyes are a blend of brown and green, like gardens of kelp beds and seagrass meadows. Irina was 10 years old. She was excited about the coming summer, the coming New Year, her favorite holiday. Underneath the bed she shared with her older sister Edith, there were 4 bananas ripening. Each year, Papa received them as a bonus from the trucking company he worked for as a mechanical engineer. They were the only bananas the family got all year. The coming of the bananas was an occasion of pride and joy for the whole family. It was always with great ceremony that Papa unveiled the bananas from his work bag. They were green and hard. Mama would grab a small basket from the kitchen, line it with a white towel, and then carefully place the bananas side by side. Papa placed the basket underneath the girls' bed and told them they were in charge of the ripening process. Edith was less keen on observing the bananas, but Irina took the job seriously. She knew from prior years that the ripening process for bananas is very specific. A green banana will first turn yellow with green tips before it turns completely yellow. If you don't eat it immediately, its smell will grow sugary and strong. Small brown spots will form on the banana skin. From the point Papa placed the bananas underneath the bed, Irina knew the family had 4 or 5 days until they were perfectly ripe for eating. And that's from the beginning of Somewhere in the Unknown World, from Irina to Irene. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you for reading that. Before we dive into the questions, I'll just give a brief overview of the book and some of your past work, if that's okay.
Please.
So Somewhere in the Unknown World, for those of you who haven't read it, bears witness to refugees whose lives have been upended, who have courageously forged new narratives in a foreign land. It's a profound record of displacement, a sobering meditation on the lives of people who get lost behind statistics and political rhetoric, and a tender form of as told to storytelling that takes us around the world. All of the stories are told by refugees living in Minnesota, a state that has welcomed more refugees per capita than any other in the U.S. And Kao Kalia Yang is the author of The Song Poet, which received the 2017 Minnesota Book Award and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Chautauqua Prize, the Penn USA Literary Award, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Her previous book, The Late Homecomer, also received the Minnesota Book Award. Her children's books include A Map into the World, which won the Minnesota Book Award, and The Shared Room. Yang, a regular contributor to NPR's On Being, lives in St. Paul. So yeah, this is a really excellent book. I'm really glad that so many people have been able to read it and understand more of what it means to be a refugee. And I'm really excited for our conversation. So I guess first off, there are 15 different narrators in this book, including yourself. All of the voices are so distinct, and they bring each story to life in unique ways. So I'm just wondering, what was the process of writing this like? How did you collect and revise the stories, and how did you make sure that each voice remained true to the person who was speaking to you?
Thank you, Joe, for that fantastic question. I began this book in 2016. President Donald J. Trump had just been elected, and already here in the shift in refugees, but all of our the book is I've been inside of me for a long time. I became a writer at the age of 22, on the journey of being a writer. And my origin story is important, and I approach and answer questions. I thought, like so many refugees before, that we needed doctors and lawyers. Doctors heal what is broken in the human body. Refugees protect the rights we never had enough of. My older sister died at North End Elementary School in the 3rd grade, so we decided she was the one who was good with words. She was going to be our lawyer. So then by default, I was going to become our doctor. It was fine. What I wanted to become one day was a good person, and a doctor would be just one more pathway there. So I was at Carleton College, and I was studying American Studies, cross-cultural studies, women and gender studies, and I was on the pre-med track. In my senior year, my grandmother, Jolie, this old woman who had never been to school, who didn't know how to read or write, her biggest fear was that she would be forgotten. She passed away just a few months before my graduation. And I thought I was writing her a love letter. You know, all of my life, every time we were apart, I would write Grandma these love letters. And I knew that she wouldn't be able to read them, but I knew that she would still see my love coming through, that I hadn't forgotten, that I was still holding on. And so my very first book began as a love letter to this old woman. I thought I was going to commemorate on the page her life story. And I thought it would be so good if the world perhaps might read this book and remember her along with me. This old woman who told me that there was no Hmong land in the map of a bigger world. That when she died, she would climb this mountain in her heart, swing open the door to the house of her youth. Dinner would be ready. Her mom and dad would be there. And they would look and they would say, "Why are you so late in coming home?" When my grandma died, I knew in some ways that I would become a late homecomer, that it would be a long time before we would meet again. That was where my story began, in writing hers. I understood in the process that what I was using Memoir to do was to correct history, because in no history book is there anything written of the Hmong American experience, of the secret war in Laos, America's biggest covert operation, of the declaration of genocide against my people after the Americans left, and what happened in that leaving. I knew when I was writing my grandma's story that I was not only writing her story, but my own history, the history of a generation of young Hmong Americans rising up in this country. And so with that first experience, I learned how to carry the stories of my family. But I also understood, because I was one of the first published Hmong writers in the national literary scene, the importance of representation. From my earliest days, Joe, people asked me if I wanted to write their stories, different refugees from different groups, and I didn't feel I was equipped. I didn't feel I could do a good job. And so I said, "No, but I will listen. You can tell me, and I will be a vessel for your story with you." But finally, we were in 2016, and every single reason for me not to do it was because I was afraid. You see, the biggest lesson my grandma had taught me with her life was that we build our lives not because of our fears. We build our lives because of our faith. And I had a deeper faith that if I could lend everything I could be as an artist, that if these individuals understood that what I was giving wasn't a mirror's reflection, but painting a portrait of their lives, then maybe what we could produce in the end was a work that would be a compassionate lesson in what we have to learn from each other, in what we have to give as individuals, the very priceless and the very unforgettable truths that we live as individuals. And so I went on a quest to do that. And that's what this book is. It is a collection of portraits about these people who I respect so much, who made me braver for the entirety of the Trump presidency. The book came out in November of 2020, right after Joe Biden's election. And so in many ways, in those 4 years, it was these 14 different stories that allowed me and gave me the force of heart to enter into our world. Did I answer your question?
Oh yeah, thank you for sharing that really powerful testimony. Reading this book and these powerful stories, you're reminded that of the 26 or so million refugees around the world, each one of them is carrying a really profound story that really illuminates who they are as people and really reminds you that these are full human beings behind the statistics, and that this book could really be 26 million stories long. There's really no end to how many stories you could tell, and they would all be equally compelling. So I'm wondering, since refugees are often neglected from media narratives, they're often overlooked, how did the individuals featured in this book feel about their stories being out there? What did it mean to them, and what did it mean to their communities? These are all so vulnerable stories, so vulnerable, and it probably took a lot to open up like this. So how do they now feel that people are reading their stories?
That's such a good question. And that for me was it was like my biggest concern throughout the whole process. I went to writing school at Columbia University in New York City, and there we were taught that we shouldn't share a story until it was ready to enter into the world. In writing these stories, I broke that rule. Right after our meetings, I wrote everything I'd heard and I sent it back to the individuals, and I asked them one question. Did I get it right? Is it accurate? Did I hear correctly what you were meaning to say? And then I waited for their response. And in certain cases, there were like spelling errors or dates were all wrong. It took me another year to go back to those stories and to turn them into the stories that you will ultimately read in Somewhere in the Unknown World, you know? And once that draft was done, once I knew that the facts were accurate, I rested. And then, of course, publication came. And before it came into the world, I made sure that each individual got a copy of the book. I was so nervous, waiting for the text messages to come in, the emails and the calls. But immediately, there were tears. The people were tremendously moved. Sigmuda Bongsai, whose story is in here, A Burial and a Birth. Sigmuda is a playwright, a respected playwright in her own right, and a writer. And she said, the story that you wrote, I couldn't have written. Thank you. And I think it did a lot for my heart, and it did a lot for how I want to live as a writer in the world. How I believe that we are truly vessels for each other's stories, and how I think we can honor and hold those stories in this sacred space. But for me, from the very beginning, as a refugee myself, I wanted these stories to be of value to the individuals, their families, and their communities. And that's been the gift of this whole experience. So much courage, Joe. What is this story in the measure of their lives? How and where does it store up? Only time will tell.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be very affirming to know that there are a lot of people who now understand the grief that they're carrying, the trauma that they're carrying, the endurance that they needed to arrive at where they are in their lives. Um, Obviously, there are a lot of myths around what it means to be a refugee, and a lot of them are really damning myths and really unfair, and they really paint refugees in really negative lights, and it's really awful, especially in the U.S. And one of the things I love so much about this book is that a lot of the stories feel like fairy tales in a sense of like this is somebody who's rewriting history in the sense of they're actually bringing you to what actually happened and creating a new origin story for people to understand. It goes beyond usual narratives of victim and savior and invites us to reimagine what it means to be a refugee. And right now, especially during the Trump administration, there's been a lot of fraught, antagonistic political rhetoric around what it means to be a refugee, and we lose sight of the fact that refugees are full human beings with full lives. So I was wondering, since you wrote this during the Trump administration's time, how did you navigate around all of the stereotypes and the stigmas and the racism and the overall fraughtness while working on this?
Joe, I thought often about my father's words when I first became a writer. What a lot of people don't know about me is that I grew up as a selective mute in the English language. I was a girl and I was learning English just fine. But one day I went with my mother to Kmart. Light bulbs in our house had started flickering, and my mother, who was then 26, and I thought the most beautiful woman in the world, and she didn't have wrinkles on her face, standard of beauty, and she was incredibly brave. Mom and Dad had grown up in the most heavily province of Laos. Laos is the most heavily bombed country in the world. Laos didn't know it. Every 7 American bombs were raining down on them. My father used to say I would walk away from the falling bomb in parallel to the ground. I thought, how incredible. But her courage was something I'd myself. In Banbi refugee camp where I was born, my mother had 6 miscarriages after me. She made a decision to feed the 2 little girls of her, not the 6 boys inside of her, and so died somewhere on the journey. Hmong people were only given food 3 days a week. And every time my mom had a miscarriage, there was always this cry, this time is the last time. Too much blood loss. I can't begin to tell how many mornings I woke that rectangle bar for the waiting for me. And how many just as I was beginning to weep. So I belonged then to the most gorgeous woman and the most beautiful woman in the world. And Kmart, and she was asking the clerk for the things that made the world shiny. She didn't have the one English word for light bulb. My mother had a thick, and the clerk obviously, you're a native, so many of us to call this, the so us. The English we speak was accented. Is my mother's. The clerk started tapping on the floor and then walked away and never came back. And after that, I decided that if we lived in a world that did not need to hear my mom and my dad, then surely it didn't need to hear me. So I stopped talking. I became a selective mute. But the words that changed my life, that bring me just like this one. My first book had just come out, The Late Homecomer, and I was going to give a talk, and I couldn't do it. And my father walked up to me and he said, if the earth that I live on can fall on me, the sky that I live under can fall on me, the earth that I walk on can throw me off. Who am I to stand in your way? My father said, for every one of you, 2 others died so you could be here. Envision the life that you share together. These words have changed not only the heart of the young girl, but the heart of the writer inside of me, Joe. Every time I speak, it is for those 2 others who died so I could be here. Every time I exit our doors and I enter into the world, I'm not interested in meeting stereotypes. I'm interested in meeting individuals. I'm not moved by causes. I'm moved by the winds of humanity. At the end of the day, I know I will be measured by the test of time. When all is said and done, nobody gets to be the author of the book of humanity. If we're any good, we get maybe 1 line. The way of my life and the way I work on the page is the same. I don't want to be passing people by. This isn't going to be our only meeting. I'll be at this screen somewhere along this road. You will meet my name again, or I will meet yours, and I will be reminded of the character that you are in the book of Kao Kalia Yang's life. That's how I want people to feel when they enter into my story. Met these, they will remember those as friends. Just for any of us, no matter particularly hard, where so much thought impossible. And yet, the refugee, the impossible happens every day. My impossible, the girl from Bosnia, she would be sitting at Ulster College. It would be Richard Holbrooke, the guy who drafted the treaty that ended the war there, that it would be him giving the keynote and she in the audience, or that she would be placed in Kofi Annan's, his dormitory. These things are incredible, and yet they happen every single day. When the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America came to the high mountains of Laos, and they commissioned those 32,000 men and boys and girls to fight and to die on their behalf. We were a secret because they couldn't envision that there would be a writer like me emerging, of all places, from the American heartland, Joe. The impossible happens every day in the life of the refugee. This goes beyond headlines. This goes beyond stereotypes. This is, I think, the essence of what this human journey is about. This is the stuff that drives all of us when we're pushed up against a wall or a rock. We have to see out the window. And for me, that window isn't a brick wall. It's glass. I can break through it if I give it enough thought, enough time. And that's what I do that's what I do all the time when I play in the playground of words. There's no tapping feet, Joe. Nobody's gonna walk away from me when I'm at my laptop writing these stories down. And when the book is in your hands, you have the power. But the words, they're the engine of where we go. I believe in that. That's why I do what I do. And that's why I tell the kind of stories I tell.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. That was very beautiful. Um, you spoke a bit about how you were born in a refugee camp. So, from the beginning of your life, home was a very precarious concept. And for a lot of the characters, a lot of the people in these stories, home is an embattled concept. Oftentimes, their homes are destroyed, they're displaced from their homes, they're sent to environments where they struggle to forge new homes, and sometimes they never are able to recover a sense of home. So I was wondering, what did you learn about the power of home and its role in people's lives while working on this book?
Such a good question. So I was a first child. Many children born in a refugee camp don't belong to any nation. You know, I became an American citizen at the age of 20. I wanted to go study abroad, and the university, the college wanted me to be in the same line with all the other American students. And so I became a citizen, so I could go abroad. In my case, we turned to Thailand. The refugee camps are no longer there because refugee camps are not meant to last. They stand to the test of time. When I went to Thailand for the very first time in my life, Joe, I was called American. Here in America, when people say, "What are you?" the right answer is, "I am Hmong." People aren't asking whether I'm an American. But for the very first time when I left America's borders behind, people looked at me and they said, "You don't look like Hmong from the hills. You look Japanese and Chinese. You look Korean." But you're not, because you move differently, because you eat differently, because you talk differently. You're an American. That was like the first time in my life where I had to reckon with where home was in a very real way. The refugee camp that had made me was no more. I was looking at trees far taller than I am. You know, nobody knew we had been erased entirely from the land. And home started becoming, it was going to be this place where I would return, the site of so much of my work. And now, my grandma's buried here in America. And so I think to myself, no matter how beautiful the rest of the world turns out to be, when all is said and done, I will return here to the land that holds the body of my grandma. And I think the hopes and the dreams of my children, you know? So home is this place that I carry with me, but for me, it is here now. And I think what that has taught me is that home is this ever evolving truth, and it's governed by the forces of love, by the forces of life and death. For my father, a piece of his home will always be the high mountains of Laos, the place where his father was buried. He was only 2 when his father died, but because he grew up never having a father, all of his dreams kept on returning to that bit of high ground. And now we understand that a Chinese corporation is going to come and dig up the body of my grandfather. And so for my father, it's devastating. Home now will have to be somewhere else in the world. But there is no Hmong land in the map of a bigger world. It is this mountain in our hearts, you know? And that's something that I carry with me. I am Hmong from America. There are now Hmong from Canada, Hmong from French Guiana, Hmong from Germany, Hmong from all over the world. We are a population dispersed by war. And that is, in some ways, I find my home in that. If my mother could have it her way, I would write of beautiful things and happy things. I would write of castles, beneath rivers and dragons looking for love. But I write of war and I write of the journeys forth because there is beauty there to be harvested as well. In the words of my father, all of life is a garden. It is the job of the artist to harvest where we can. And so I harvest where I can. I harvest over the terrain that has created me, over the future landscapes where I want to raise my children. And in that, I build homes all along the way. However small, however tiny, and in some cases invisible, they house pieces of my heart.
That's very tragic about your father and the land. is being destroyed. Um, yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. In a lot of the stories, they're dealing with very grim subject matter, and a lot of people are being displaced from their homes in similar ways. But as you said, there's always really beautiful details as well, whether it's the human connections they form, the tenderness of their love for each other, their willingness to endure through just insurmountable odds. Um, but one thing that recurs in each of the stories, it seems, is that a lot of the individuals are never allowed time and space to process their grief and trauma. They're never allowed to really unpack it and heal from it because life just never allows them the room and the safety to do that. So I'm wondering, what can we learn from these stories about how refugees are denied the resources, the time and the space to really heal from a lot of these wounds that they have?
Mental health is something that we don't talk often enough about in terms of refugees, and certainly it isn't reflected in our refugee resettlement processes. When you're entering into a country, every refugee has to go through a physical, right? They're going to have to give you the shots, the correct vaccines. They want to test you for certain diseases or the presence thereof, but nobody ever is interested in engaging what is broken in the human heart and the human mind. It's a harder thing to solve. And that process isn't interested in that. We're just trying to save the bodies at best. Currently, that is our refugee resettlement process. But I grew up surrounded by refugees who wake up in the morning shaking. Some mornings my father tells me that there's a rock embedded in his hand, that a rocket has sliced through this boulder of his youth where his mother had sat to fed him. And now a piece of the boulder, although I can't see it, is embedded in his hand, and his hand shakes. It is the rock of memory protruding into our lives. I grew up hearing the ragged screams of my elders across the hot seasons of our lives. And so when I think about mental health, I think about the people who've raised me. In a broken world, Joe, they tried to build for me an unbroken path into the future. I walk that path, and I'm able to do the kind of work I am not because of the sadness. Mr. Michael from Eritrea in this book says that peace is possible if we hold on not only to the sad stories, but the good ones. What I write, I hope, are not only the good ones, but the great ones. In many ways, there are certain luxuries embedded in a life. When people see my mother, they see this poor refugee woman with really red hands, arthritic hands, this woman who spent too many years standing on hard cement in factory floors. They see all that is pitiful. It is hard for them to see inside her home, right? When my mom sits by the sofa and her 3 daughters gather around her and they massage her hands and her feet, there is a beauty there, a kind of laughter, a kind of gift that is too big for the world to look at. These are the things that I want to focus a light on as well. Everything else but that. I have this line written for a musical that will come out in Arizona, and it is about how history and the world may not want to hear the words from our lips, but those words are carried in our arms too. When you see a beggar on the street, it is an indictment against capitalism. It is an indictment against poverty. It is an indictment against certain powers. Even if you cannot read what is written on that cardboard sign or whatever sign it is. It is these truths that I'm always trying to grapple with and wrestle around, And I think that is the gift of art. Art is a conversation with the bigger things, but it is a conversation also with the tiny things. It is the pulse of humanity that I'm trying to feel for. And that is something that I think governmental agencies have a hard time doing. Refugee resettlement people, they're trying to find you a house and try to put you in school. They're not interested in what has been ravaged and taken, violated in your heart and your mind. The ghost children that cling to you even as you're walking every step. Where do we make room for that in our policies? And so I think that we have incredible work to do in terms of mental health and the refugee population. But I think it also forces each and every single one of us to reckon with the traumas of our life. All the things that happen to us that we can never say out loud, that we haven't yet found the words or the space or the ears willing to listen. It is a hard thing to listen to somebody's whole story and not try to make them feel better or not try to make them believe the future is something other than what it isn't. It is a hard thing. You know, I'm 40 years old. If I'm lucky, I have maybe 40 years left, Joe. I've been writing since I was 22, and if I'm lucky, maybe I get 22 more years to write these stories. But I understand that when the time comes, I will take my place among the ancestors, you know, and that it will be my descendants who live with the stories that I've written of the world that has been gifted them. But gift, I think, is the incredible word here. We have to understand that every single human being is a gift. And I think that goes beyond policy. That starts and begins with you and me in moments like this. You know, when you look at me, if you see an American, when you look at me, if you see an example of a refugee, when you look at me, if you see a mother and a daughter, then already we are breaking down walls, walls that no government can build between you and me. And that is, I think, where the power of the individual lies, where the power of literature is housed.
Yeah, there's so much that you said right there that's so beautiful, and I agree with wholeheartedly. One thing I just want to pick out is the idea that pain is embodied, like we carry it in our body. So even if someone isn't communicating verbally that they went through a traumatic experience, if you actually pay attention to how they carry themselves, you can you can witness it, you can bear witness to their trauma, and if you're there for them, it can help to heal them. And it seems like you performed some of that important work for some of these individuals in this story, and hopefully more of us can do that in our lives because it's really the work for all of us to do. Um, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about one of the primary, I guess, themes in the book, which is the actual nitty-gritty details of displacement, how people went from living lives of relative peace and security to lives of like utter uh, disorientation and fear. Um, a lot of the stories seem to be insisting that like these events happened and that's why I'm in the US right now. So I'm just wondering what kind of role storytelling like this can play in transforming the political narratives that tell us that refugees are like a burden on society and so on and so forth.
You know, you asked about mental health and you asked about trauma. And I think one of the ways that allow us to combat these things, or at least to make room for them in our lives, is through narrative, through the power of storytelling. I come from an oral culture. So for the Hmong, a written language wasn't devised until the 1950s. And when a French missionary came to the high mountains and wanted to translate the Bible using the Roman alphabet. You know, a long time ago, we had a written language, but the Chinese, the imperial kingdom practiced cultural genocide, and so the language was outlawed. The women and the girls tried to hide it in our clothing. Hmong women the world over, wherever you go, if they're Hmong people, are known for our incredible embroidery. It was born out of an effort to preserve a language that had been outlawed. And so the work that I do on the page for my people is an entirely different thing. I'm working in a different medium, which is to say this. I come from a culture that believes that words are as valuable, if not more so, than money. That we use them to buy and to sell and to create and to destroy in the world. They are the units, they are the building blocks of so much that is valuable. When I think about storytelling, I think about my Uncle Jude. I have an uncle called Uncle Jude, who's now an old man. But when I was a little girl, he was still young. And he would tell me stories, Joe. And we didn't have books or anything. We didn't have movies. And so he would use his arm and he'd tell me, every piece of hair on my arm, this is a tree in the jungle. You see my knuckles, these are the mountains. The veins, these are the rivers of my youth. The whole of the world would emerge on the stretch of his arm. I think about this all the time. When people talk about refugees, they talk about all the things that we didn't have or we don't have when we enter into a country. Nobody wants to see the scars hidden underneath the clothes we wear. Nobody wants to understand the piercing of the metal, the shrapnel that is embedded in our flesh. Through the power of storytelling, we can look into the hearts of individuals. You see me here, but because I'm opening my mouth and my words are creating pictures in the air between you and me across these invisible lines of electricity, you can begin to see that behind me there's 1,000 ancestors, Joe. And their only dream is that I make it here today. That today I'm in fact living their dreams, right? I become more powerful than just Kao Kalia Yang, this girl who gave herself a haircut, you know, on a hot summer's day. living through a pandemic. I become part of this bigger world vision. And each and every single one of us are a vision like that. That is the gift of storytelling. Above and beyond just refugees and refugee resettlement. The moment you meet somebody's story, the moment you really take it inside and carry it with you, it informs who you are in the world. It shifts and changes you forever. And so, yeah, even in a time of nothing, our tears and our words, these are our gifts to each other. I think storytelling is the key to so much of the work of dismantling the unjust systems that govern all of our lives. And that's why I'm in it. That's why I'm not leaving anytime soon. You know, I believe in these kingdoms that have allowed us to be, that will allow us forward.
I think it's so important that you see yourself as part of a lineage of thousands of ancestors, because I think one of the effects of colonialism is to try to eradicate history and mire us in a perpetual present of instability so that we forget these deep roots that we have that connect us to the vastness of human history and who we are as people. And that's one of the things that hovers over this book, the repercussions of colonialism and colonial violence. And I'm wondering, when you really understand this history, what sorts of obligations do you think it compels from colonizers like the US who have caused such harm around the world?
You know, so I'm the descendant of 3 shamans, which is an odd occurrence because shamanism is not something that one chooses. It chooses you. But my grandma, the one who I knew and who loved me so well, the inspiration for my first book, Jolie, she used to tell me, every time you have the power to help somebody, you have the ability to hurt them. And that is something that we don't think enough about as individuals, as a society, as a world. Every time we have the power to help somebody, we have the ability to hurt them. Joe, it is an honor to be the one to be able to give. It is an honor to be able to be the one to be able to offer. On so many occasions across my life, I've been on the other side of the spectrum. Yes, I'm a refugee, but I'm also a product of the poverty that is possible here in America. You know, how many church basements have I visited with my mother, where her hands are shaking with that empty bag, waiting for the woman on the other side to give maybe a mitten or a pair of socks so that her children might make it through the winter. And people in America call it charity. And charity, I think, in some ways safeguards the real truth that is happening here. I'm in a position of power. I have the ability to help you. But if I don't, if I say, that I want to give it to somebody else, then that is also within my power and it should be within my responsibility. With power comes tremendous responsibility. We hear that in superhero films all across the board. But for me, I first realized it, as a little girl. My older sister, Dao, is a year and 9 months older than me. But she acts like she's the world older. By the 3rd grade, she was already handwriting resumes for my mom and dad so they might get work in the factories. And I remember her saying, she's working on this resume for our mother, and she's saying, I would try my very best to work fast because I have children to feed. And my mother was so shy because that felt like it was such an extravagant comment. And yet I could just hear the desperation of those statements. And those words have stayed with me across the stretch of 4 decades. Those words, they won't disappear. I would try to work fast because I have 4 children to feed. America and all these colonial imperial powers, they refuse to be in that position, that understanding, that privileged place that they've taken from the world. Nobody wants to be vulnerable. Nobody wants to be poor. But the truth is that people are vulnerable and people are poor. And until we can reckon with the forces that build these things, we cannot begin to call ourselves good humans to each other. I give all these talks, and sometimes people have no idea who I am, and sometimes they don't care who the Hmong are. But the thing that matters is that if I speak, if you understand a little bit better, Joe, then the quota of the world's understanding is already shifted. So every time I write, every time I speak, I'm not looking for agreement or disagreement. I could care less. If I deepen your ability to understand a human being, an individual more deeply. I have deepened, in some sense, your own humanity, not the humanity of the people I'm writing from, but your own humanity. And then the quota of humanity rises in the world, and maybe we stand a bigger chance. I used to believe when I was young, a younger writer, that I wanted recognition for my work because it would make my parents so proud. It might give them solid ground to stand on. But you know, Joe, I now understand that I had misjudged my parents. They understand, like refugees across the world, so well the forces at work. It wasn't going to be a testament to the quality of my work. My work would be the same, regardless of recognition. They were already proud. The thing that matters is that I wanted to make them believe that against all of these systemic measures, that somebody had taken notice, that somebody had picked up a book and learned a little bit more deeply, that the world was filled with more love. And I think about them all the time, my mom and dad, these young refugees who'd walked from war and despair and death, and they looked toward life. They who had taught me that I'm not a child of poverty or despair. In fact, I am hope being born, the captain to a more beautiful future. That's what I think we should do. That's what I think governments should do when they look upon thin refugee kids waiting in camps. They just shouldn't tell a kid their limits. They should push them for their best possibilities, their highest potential. Because governments at the end of the day are made up of people. Individuals no smarter than you or me, only more privileged, you know? And so that's what I try to do. And I think that's what they should try to do.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. Those so important to hear. I wish more people could hear that message because it's really something that our world needs right now, a better understanding of the forces at play and the obligations we have to each other, especially when, as the great Nelson Mandela said, poverty in this world is all manufactured. It could be eradicated immediately if enough people understood that resources could be shared equitably and violence doesn't have to be exported around the world. So every character in this book is based in Minnesota, and I know that Minnesota has its own problems of racism and deprivation, and it's very difficult to make a life there if you're coming from another part of the world with very little assistance. But I'm wondering what makes Minnesota so inviting for the people in this book, and what can other states in the U.S. learn from Minnesota potentially?
That is a great question. So Minnesota becomes a hotbed for refugee resettlement because of the Lutheran churches. Minnesota has so many Lutheran churches, and then you add in the Catholic churches and the Protestant churches. And initially, it was these faith groups that sponsored the first refugee families, and the refugee families sponsored each other. Minnesota is like this headquartered state, so like 3M is here, Medtronics is here, which means that there are a lot of low-skill jobs for folk coming without the foundations of a solid education. Refugees come from a variety of backgrounds, but the truth in our processes is that we resettle refugees into poverty here in America. And so Minnesota has this infrastructure in place, right? This idea of charity, and then you have these low level jobs, and so people can come and kind of make a run at it, make a life of it. But the beautiful thing about Minnesota is also that it is deeply embedded in Native American values and beliefs, Joe. We talk about how young America is, and then Minnesota itself, we're not even 300 years old as a state, But of course, the Native peoples have been here for a long time. And there here embedded this idea that we're only here for a time, a brief amount of time, that we preserve what is here for the next generation. That none of us, no matter how many acres of land you own, get to be here forever, And I think that has a lot to do with why so many different refugee groups have taken residence here and have continued to live here. We put forth into the Congress because of the refugee population, right? Ilhan Omar, Keith Ellison. We are an interesting, exciting state, one of the most racist states in terms of measures of equity around the nation. And yet, we are also this pocket of excitement. We're right in the heart of the Midwest. So if you think about the country like a person or a living thing with hands and feet, right? If you wrap yourself around that, you get right here in Minnesota. So I think what we see here is the possibility The shifts of a nation we feel here first, which way we're going to turn. The coasts, they lead in different ways. Um, but we haven't yet looked at these Midwestern states very closely. And that was also one of the underlying, I think, impetus for me to write Somewhere in the Unknown World and to home it here. Because I know that there are Minnesotas everywhere around the world too. Greece is in Minnesota right now against maybe the wishes of certain political sectors, you know, but all these countries that house refugees, they have these like pockets of progressive possibility. And so I really wanted to begin to create space and place for these different sites that we don't talk about very much when we talk about refugees and international issues.
Yeah, I think we can all imagine much better possibilities of how we receive refugees in this country. I was really um, stunned by the story of the Afghan refugee who went to Sweden, and even though he had a very traumatizing experience dealing with the guards, ultimately he was received at a luxury hotel, it seemed like, and he was living
Yeah.
in relative splendor for a few years. And like, why can't we do that in the U.S.? Why can't more models of resettlement begin with that sort of comfort and space and resources? I think that's very possible. But
Yeah, our neighbors in Canada, you know, the refugee resettlement process is a whole year, Joe. And here in the US, we give our refugees 3 months, 90 days.
I know it's very jarring when you really compare it to other places. But this has been a really wonderful conversation. I'm hoping that we can bring on some voices from the audience to share some of their thoughts and ask a few questions, if that's okay.
That
Hi. So like Joe said, we're going to start our Q&A portion. So if anyone has a question, please click the question mark icon on the bottom of your screen and type it in. I'm going to bring up a couple people one by one to ask their question. When we do, please say your name, where you're from, and what's your question. So I'm going to start with the first person here.
Hi, Kao.
Hello.
Hello. I'm Royston. I'm from Pretoria in South Africa. I read a portion of the book where you said that a lot of the older people always talked about the past. They sort of had like a nostalgia. Did you ever feel disconnected, like when, for example, if I have to contextualize it to my own context, I didn't grow up during apartheid in South Africa. So I don't identify with that time of the 80s and the 70s. So there's often a disconnect where I don't really understand what they've been through. Have you ever felt that with your own context?
That is such a good question. I don't know that I felt disconnected, but there were times when I felt like perhaps I already knew the story. You know, if people talked about the war, the past, and I felt like, okay, I already knew that. And so the level of my listening wasn't where it should be. You know, we're so fond of saying, speak louder, but we don't say as much, listen harder. And so there have been moments across my youth, particularly my teenage years, when all the hormones were flooding and I was trying so hard just to be like everyone else. You know, when it was easier for me to disengage and to connect with that history. I think that with the passing of my grandma when I was 22 years old, it really kind of shifted, it regrounded me in who I am and who I would become in a very real way. You know, I understood that if I was not a part of the past, that I would become a part of the future. And I began to understand the kind of person I wanted to be in that future. And that has helped me again and again return to that past with grace, not with a broken heart, because it's hard to work from a broken place, but with grace and with understanding. My only job is to learn as much as I can so I can give as much as possible, which is not everything. Did I respond to
Thank you
your
so
question?
much. Yes, yes, that's a very it's a very healing I understand what you mean. I feel it's a very healing. Like, how can I say? I look forward to tomorrow. That's what I'm almost like. I, in my own capacity, when you answered that, I look forward to tomorrow. I look forward to my own future now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, can you tell us your name and where you're from and your question as well?
Yes. Hi. Yes. Sorry, I had some camera issue. Yes, I'm Rafia, and I'm from Pakistan. And my question is that whenever we try to describe our emotions or if we try to start something new, we're often judged and criticized. Like people try to demotivate us. So did Kao have to go through the same thing? Like, were you criticized or did people support your writing?
That is such a good question. You know, whenever I give a good talk, and it's also maybe because I'm a woman, you know, whenever I give a good talk, people are like, oh, that was so raw and emotional. It is never, oh, that was so smart and brilliant or even moving, right? And so, in many ways, my biggest comment whenever I do a good job is, oh, you're not what I expected. Because people's expectations of me are never very high. That is the truth. And so, I used to be very hurt by it and I used to be very confused by it. But now I just see that as a different way for me to do the work that I do. If I am not what you expect, then I can hit places that you didn't expect. Right? I can travel into places and spaces that you didn't expect me to go to. And so I've learned how to use that as a power, and you will too. It takes time, but we become who we are because of the hard things in life, not the easy things, not the things that are given, but the things that are taken in some ways. And I think when I began to realize and to understand that, it gave me a different kind of freedom to move in the world and to be in the world. You know, when I was much younger, it made more sense that if I had a talk like this one, I would put on more makeup, right? And maybe dress nicer because I think maybe that would change the way people heard me. But I realized it didn't matter. It didn't matter because what people were expecting from me it was too small for what I am. Does that make sense? So there comes a
Yes.
life when the relationship changes and you will move in that relationship and you will begin to understand your source of power.
Okay. Thank you so very much for answering this question. I actually needed to hear this.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Nikki. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and I live in New York, but I'm currently back in Madison. And I work at Global Citizen as well. But my question is, so in chapter 13 or 10, sorry, in chapter 10, the point of view changed from third person to first person. Was this deliberate, and why?
Yes, because there are times in the story where I could feel people more keenly, Nikki. And I wanted the writing to be transparent and to honor that truth. There are moments in the story where I have to zoom out a little bit further to see like the fullness of the situation and the context of different stories. But there are moments when I could feel the person so keenly. In the actual interviews, those are the moments when we're both crying. You know, Kleenex up against faces, trying to stem our tears, but also make room for each other to be. And so in those moments, I went right into the first person because it was true to the emotional truth of that moment. So from a craft perspective, I was using the different perspectives to zoom in and out and to do different kinds of work around the storytelling.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki.
I think Alicia's coming back on the stage in a moment.
Hi, everyone. That wraps up our Q&A. It was really great to hear from you today. Is there anything you want to leave us with to wrap up this event?
Yes, I started with a reading, so I'm going to close with the reading, okay? And I'm going to read from from sisters on the other side of the river. This is the first story that I wrote in the collection, and so I want to end here. I think every refugee can connect deeply with this moment. When you survive a war, when you've gone through a lot of things, there are truths that you carry inside of you. You're doing well for yourself and your family. You are a good man. They don't know the truth. They don't know that nearly 40 years ago, on the banks of the Mekong River, on my way to freedom, I condemned 2 sisters to war. They don't know that I cannot forget those 2 girls, their eyes that night round like the moon in the high sky, looking at me. The lie I told, the lie I carry. They don't know that one day soon, when my time comes, I will look into those eyes again and see the knowledge that I was not the man the sisters had been waiting for, and that I could not be him. I pray and I hope that in another life, beneath a different moon, I will be the man to turn that raft around. If only. I think that's who we all are in some sense. There are mistakes that we have made. There are mistakes that we will make. But what we cannot let die is this hope that in another lifetime, in another year, in another season, that we will be that person we've been dreaming of. And I leave you with those words because I think that is what we need to be kind to ourselves and to our world. This offering of grace, this understanding that there are 365 days in a year, not because on a given day we have everything it takes to make what possible, the kind of world that we dream for those who will come after, but because we have 365 attempts at making that day happen for each and every single one of us. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for joining me from wherever you're from in the world. This is our world and we will make it still what we need it to be.
Thank you. Beautifully said. I think I can tell and feel the emotion for your passion for these people's stories that you told, and even your own. And so I appreciate you giving us your time and your energy today.
Thank you all.
Bye. All right, guys, that wraps it up for us today. I want to thank you for joining us throughout the month of June and reading Somewhere in the Unknown World today. It sparked great conversation and insight into several refugee stories, including our author, Kalia Yang. Please join us next month in reading The Book of V by Anna Solomon, a novel intertwining the lives of 3 women across 3 centuries of their stories of power and desire finally converging in present day. Just like you did for this book, get your hands on a copy of the book, join our discussion in our Facebook group, Global Citizen All Access, and then enter to attend our virtual discussion author with Anna in September. We look forward to seeing you there, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. You can leave this event by simply closing out of the webpage. Bye, everyone.